No campfires. And I might have to poop in a bag? Hey everyone, I'm Calman, and welcome back to my channel, Everyday Backpacker, the channel where I take you along on my journeys down the trail and show you how I get there. Today we're going to continue the series on planning. So in our first video, we talked a little bit about deciding where you wanted to go and some of the things that might crop up in making that decision. So this video, we're going to go ahead and assume you've already made a decision on where you want to go, probably already even deciding on who you want to take along. But we're going to talk a little bit about some of the special regulations that may pop up in your travel and shape the way that your trip is going to go. Now, I had one person comment about how the last video was really great information for new hikers, and that's absolutely true. I want to cater to both new and experienced backpackers. But I also think it's important for us as experienced backpackers to kind of revisit some of these real basic skills in order to keep those skills fresh and not to lose some of that knowledge. Alright, so just in the last video, we're going to use a series of questions to kind of guide us along the idea of finding out some of these special regulations. Because as you probably have experienced in the trail before, not all areas have the same type of regulations. So it's important to make sure that we do a little bit of research in order to make sure that we as outdoor users aren't inadvertently violating the rules of the site that we go to. And so if you're wondering where I got some of these questions from, I actually have been using one of my favorite guidebooks, which is the Backpacker's Field Manual. And this is a book by Rick Curtis. And so far I've found this book to be very handy. It does cover a lot of different areas, and like I said, really great information to kind of keep up on. So, those questions. The first question that really anybody should ask before they send out into an area is, are there any permits needed for this area? And if so, where do I obtain them? Most of your national forests don't require any kind of a permit, but a lot of your national parks do, and we'll talk a little bit why that is later. But then again, some wilderness areas do and don't. For instance, the Beartooth Absaroka Wilderness area does not require any kind of permits. However, the place that we're going to be going to, the Cloud Peak Wilderness, does have a voluntary permit system. Now, there is no fee for this permit, and it is basically they just want a general idea of where you're going to be at. And the main purpose for this permit is to make sure that you have read and followed some of those regulations that they put out. But it is important to know these things because that particular permit is only obtainable at certain trailheads. So you go to the trailhead, pull out the paper, fill it out, drop the other copy in the book, and keep the hard copy for yourself. Or you can go to certain ranger districts to find that permit. But again, had we not done some of that research, we would have not known that. Another thing to consider with permits is how far in advance do you need to apply. Some places are extremely busy and have over a year's worth of waiting lists. Fortunately, the Cloud Peak Wilderness, where we're going to be going, is a fill out on site type permit. So there's no limit. But some of these areas that are highly sensitive require you to apply for a permit long in advance, in some cases even do a lottery system so that not everybody gets an opportunity to go. So again, you need to be making sure that you know what those permit regulations are. Is there any cost for the permit? Some permits do have a cost associated with them. Most national parks have a cost with their permit. Other places, again, it's just a voluntary permit so they can keep track of who's in the park. But there may be a cost associated with that permit system. Are there any special rescue regulations in that area? Some places in Alaska require that you pay for your own rescue if you get into a situation. Most places down here in the States, this is not necessarily the case, but it's always a good idea to know what situations you might encounter if rescue is required. This may dictate whether or not you're going to go into certain areas or not, in the unlikely possibility that you might need rescue. Another really important question is there a limit to the group size? So some places definitely make sure that you don't have a group over a certain size. I believe for the Absaroka Beartooth Wilderness, and I'll double check on this, it's 12 persons or less. And again, most of these are that associated with leave no trace type principles. It's important to know how much of an impact you're having on these areas. Wilderness areas especially are going to be limited because they are going to try to decrease the amount of impact overall in their areas. And along with that, where can you and can you not camp? This is important for many reasons because some areas do not allow camping, especially above certain altitudes, because alpine areas are very susceptible to being damaged. Or, for instance, Yellowstone National Park requires you to camp in certain designated campsites. And the reason for that is, for instance, Yellowstone National Park does not allow bear kegs. Wait, isn't Yellowstone in grizzly country? Why in the hell won't they let you use a bear keg? Yep, you heard me right. They don't allow bear kegs. The reason that they don't allow bear kegs is because at their required campsites, they have pre-made poles to hang your food on so that you don't have to select a properly sized tree to hang your bear bag. And they feel that it is more consistent if people use those bars than it is to try to mess with the bear kegs. So even though it's in grizzly country, they do not allow the use of bear kegs. But the flip side of that is that you do have to camp in your designated campsites. Another thing to look at is, are there any restricted areas due to hazards or animal activity? So hazards are pretty obvious if there's areas that are prone to, say, landslides or just generally not conducive to people being there, they may be restricted. Animals is a little bit harder. The best example I can think of off the top of my head for animals is there's a section of the Pacific Crest Trail that is currently closed due to an endangered species of frog. So they are not allowing people into that area, and it's kind of important to make sure that we are listening to those areas because we don't want to be the reason why more restrictions are thrown at campers. So even though it may be kind of a pain in the butt and you may not necessarily agree with it, at least follow those rules and make sure that you're doing a good job representing the community. Another really big one is, are fires allowed? Fires is one of those very interesting things because I've talked to people who say, I can't possibly go out and camp unless I have a fire. Then I know people who don't ever have a fire at all. Generally speaking, I don't have fires. I use a camp stove, and I frankly don't like it when I go through an area that is pretty pristine and see fire rings all over the place. Sorry if you like fires, but that's just how I feel. So generally speaking, I don't have fires. Every once in a while, I'll allow myself, if the conditions allow it, and there's already that scar there. But some of the areas that aren't going to allow fires are going to be areas that are higher up in altitude. For instance, along the beaten path here in Montana, there is a section that does not allow any campfires because it is an alpine area. And alpine areas are dramatically impacted for many, many years by fires. Even though it might seem like an innocuous thing, they have very, very sensitive soils that have, living bioorganisms in them that can be greatly disturbed by a fire. And it's just best to kind of follow those regulations because even though you may think it's only one fire, that fire damage is going to be there probably for a couple hundred years. So consider this when you're using it. Along those same lines, in the Cloud Peak Wilderness that we're going to be at, the majority of our trail is above 9,500 feet, which happens to be the limit for them to not allow campfires. So if you're a campfire junkie, this trail isn't going to be a good one for you. So we definitely have to make sure that we're bringing stoves and everything along those lines to be able to cook. So if you're going to be in an area that doesn't allow campfires and that's how you primarily cook, you're going to have to find alternative ways to get your meals made. And the last part is, are there any special leave no trace practices? Now I know, leave no trace is one of those things that gets a bad rap by some people in the backcountry. whether you agree with Leave No Trace or not, what Leave No Trace is not trying to do, they're not trying to tell you how to live in the backcountry. They're not trying to give you rules that if you break, you're going to have some guy show up and hit you with a stick. They're really trying to make sure that these areas that we're using are able to be used by everyone, not just yourself. And it's really important for us to do these things to protect the land, not only for the actual inhabitants of it, the native animals and plant life, but also for those of us that are visitors. You wouldn't want somebody to come into your house, build a fire in the middle of it, drag mud through, and then take off. It's the same thing. We have to be good stewards of this land. Otherwise, it's not going to be nice for all of us. We don't like showing up to a campsite that's been trashed, so don't trash that campsite for somebody else coming along. Along those lines, you do have to make sure, though, that there aren't some areas in the area that we're going to that have special considerations. For instance, some places you have to pack out all of your waste, not just your toilet paper, all of it. Like the solid parts, your poop. You got to poop in a bag, carry it out. Mount Whitney is a great example, and as I found out in my research for our Cloud Peak Wilderness trip, there's about a 2-mile stretch where we dive into an area that does require a wag bag. Hopefully I don't have to use it, but it's important to have it along because, again, I don't want to be that guy that does the thing that everybody says don't do. All right, so those are some of the questions and considerations that you want to think about. So let's talk a little bit about some of those resources again that you can use to find these things. And I'm going to just briefly recap because I think we covered quite a bit of that in the last video. But since we're here, we might as well look at it. Maps. Maps are important for finding those areas that have special restrictions and knowing exactly where you're supposed to be when you have to start using those personal restrictions. So, again, areas that don't have fires, areas where there's no camping involved, hazard areas, and areas where you have to take special Leave No Trace things like pooping in a bag. Along those same lines is guidebooks. This is where I found out that we need to do permits as well as that area of special consideration. So guidebooks, again, great source of information on resources for special considerations. Agency websites. So National Park Service or National Forest Service. Those are areas, their websites are great sources of information for finding out current restrictions that may not be in the books that are temporary, as well as other considerations for your trip. And lastly, we talked a little bit about Leave No Trace, which is a really important thing these days. But the the Leave No Trace Center for Outdoor Ethics is a great source of information for Leave No Trace associated practices. Not only what practices, but also why the practices are important. And then you can also get information like this booklet here, which is specific to the Rocky Mountains. They have several different areas that are specific to certain land sources because the Leave No Trace practices here in the Rocky Mountains aren't going to be the same as, say, the Everglades in Florida. So it's important, again, to know the different regional Leave No Trace items. And that's it. So anything that I missed, let me know in the comments. Any other considerations you think are important to talk about, also leave those in the comments below. The next video, I'm changing things up a bit. I'm adding a section, but hey, it's my channel. I can do what I want. But next video, we're going to talk a little bit about group selection and group dynamics. So if you do mostly solo trips, you won't have to watch this one. But if you do decide you want to go hiking, I'll talk a little bit about some of the things that you can do for picking the people that you want to go along the trip with and how to kind of ward off some of those conflicts that may or may not arise on the trail before you ever even hit the trail. After that, we'll talk a little bit about the emergency procedures again, and then the last video in this series will be that last minute crunch planning, the things that you need for is like food, gear, preparation, and all that fun stuff. And since I've got all of my gear ready for the season, including my tent, which has been recently repaired, we're good to go in that realm. I'm super excited. I hope you found this video enjoyable and you found some good useful information from it. If you did find it enjoyable and useful, please don't hesitate to hit the subscribe button and the little bell to notify you when more videos come out. And as always, keep hiking on.